Good afternoon, everyone. It's July 9th, 2025, and welcome to the second of our July office hour sessions with the El Paso Electric and E3 team and GridWorks here facilitating this office hour discussion. As many of the stakeholders know, we asked stakeholders during our workshop on July 1st for issues they felt needed some additional time and discussion. So we've scheduled these July office hours. The first one was last week. Recording from that meeting is available on the GridWorks website. We're also recording today's office hour. And fortunately, we've got a presentation from the E3 and EPE team, which will also be posted on the GridWorks website shortly after this office hour concludes. So our plan for this hour is to turn the video and the microphone over to E3 and EPE to give some updates and respond to questions on three topics. One was the ELCC values and how they're calculated for the analysis that's been run. Second of all, when in July 1st, when Ben presented the results of the long duration energy storage scenario that stakeholders requested, he noted a couple of updates to that, so that will be discussed. And also people had questions about costs and benefits and some details about the Eddy County HVDC tie to the connection there to the Southwest Power Pool. So let me first ask Emmanuel or Judy, are there anything that you wanted to say on today's office hour before we turn the podium over to Ben?
Nothing from the EPE team today. We're just happy everybody's in attendance and we welcome all of your questions.
Great, thank you. One slight administrative announcement. We did advertise our office hours as having no new information being presented, but given this very dynamic planning conversation, there may be some material or context that is new to folks. Again, that's why we're recording this, and we will inform all stakeholders of such, including the presentation that Ben will make today, so that all stakeholders can get access to the information and review it at their leisure. So that's our only administrative announcement. The next office hour is a week from today, July 16th. We've extended it to an office 90 minutes session because there's going to be some great information shared about synopsis from the modeling results, trying to put all the pieces together about those analyses. And so it'll be a slightly longer office hour from 3 to 4:30 instead of from 3 to 4 on Wednesday, July 16th. So I think that's dispenses with the administrivia, and let's get to the heart of the discussion. Ben, let me turn over the presentation and the slide presentation to you.
Perfect. Thank you, Margie. Just also noting I am having some IT issues right now. So Emmanuel, Judy, you do have my cell phone number. If for some reason you no longer can hear me, please text me. So I'm not sat here talking into an echo chamber. But I'll go ahead and get started with, hopefully we won't see any issues. All right. Let's see if this is going to work. Okay, let's start. So Margie, can you just confirm you can see my screen?
Yes, Ben, can see and hear you still. See the screen
Okay.
and hear your voice.
Perfect. Okay, wonderful. Okay, let's start with the Eddy tie analysis. So just in the interest of time, I've only got an hour, 55 minutes now to cover a lot of materials. So I am going to skip over the materials that I have previously presented, but obviously have them here available if people have questions. So just in, very quick oversight here, we evaluated a scenario in which there was an additional 200 megawatt connection to the Southwest Power Pool via the Eddy County HVDC tie. As we looked at the analysis, initial kind of thoughts here was showed if you had 70 megawatts of accredited capacity, which was the kind of the somewhat arbitrary number that we used, you would avoid equivalent amount of firm resources, most notably gas CTs being added to the system. And if you kind of come down through the results, again, I'm not going to revisit everything here, but when we looked at the key takeaways, we noted that the economic benefit of kind of rebuilding the tie was approximately $50 million per annum. So you can see here on the prior chart, you've seen about $50 million of savings. It gets a little bit higher in the out years as you start going to 2040 to 2045. The big issue, or the big item, I should say, that was missing from this analysis was the cost of rebuilding the tie. Per Ms. Stevens' questions, we went away, we spoke with EPE, kind of got an estimate for rebuilding the tie, and have kind of taken another look at this analysis. So one kind of new slide here to present today. Again, just a reminder, the 6 stakeholder meeting with which this was originally presented did not include the cost of rebuilding the tie. Therefore, it's just an avoided cost analysis. And it showed the $50 million of savings per year. If we look now, and these are kind of pretty broad estimates, but the approximate cost of rebuilding the tie is somewhere in the region of $200 to $300 million kind of capital costs. EPE are currently working on firming up these estimates. So hopefully in the near future, this will be a smaller band. It won't be 200 to 300. We'll get a little bit closer. But if you kind of just take the revenue requirements on an annual basis, or the cost of this tie, that kind of capital investment of 200 to 300 million would be about $20 to $30 million per year. So just broadly speaking, if you take the benefits of $50 million a year, you subtract the cost of $20 to $30 million a year, you're looking somewhere in the region of $20 to $30 million per year of savings. So that includes the cost. So this one obviously looks extremely promising at this stage. I just caveat it by saying there's obviously some moving pieces here. The cost of the tie, the cost of alternative supply side resources that have been avoided. So the avoided generation by rebuilding the tie, that's kind of has some softness to it, especially with the new bill that's just been passed, could increase those costs. So there's a few moving parts, but definitely looking good at this point in time, and definitely one, just from this initial analysis, that would require certainly further, more detailed work, firming up the cost analysis, doing more scenario and sensitivity analysis just on the Eddy rebuild. So I'll pause there. It may be, Margie, if it's okay with you, just ask if Ms. Stevens has any follow-up questions first, and then throw it over to the rest of the group.
Great suggestion. Anastasia, let's, since you had posed the question originally in the chat request for this topic, let's turn it over to you for the first question. And then I see Don Kurtz, you have your hand up. We'll come to you second.
Okay. Well, I'm glad you put some prices on it. I'm just wondering, is this the first one, since you said this is sort of an approximation at this point, is this the way you would ordinarily model an option such as this? Or is this something you're sort of, winging as you go?
No, this is so what we would typically do. We would put the tie into the model with the overnight construction costs of the 200 or the $300 million.
Mm-hmm.
The model would then calculate a revenue requirement, the $20 to $30 million, and that would be embedded within the model. So most of the time, to answer your question, this would be done directly in the model. But because all we're looking at here is adding one variable, i.e. the capital cost of rebuilding the tie, we can do this very easily externally of the model, and it would pretty much give you the same results.
And is the 20 to 30 revenue requirement based on a 40-year life of the tie, a 20-year life of the tie? What's the, are we doing apples and oranges here?
Yeah, so it's a great question. At the moment, the $50 million worth of savings is, just that average over the 15-year planning horizon, or the 2030 through 2045. So that one's only on a 15-year. the way we did the revenue requirements was on kind of a rate of return basis. So it's kind of a little bit agnostic to the length of the project. So essentially it looks at like an ARR of about 10%. That's why these kind of numbers are 10%. So if you started looking at when you've got the cost estimates come back and you've got some more detailed information, if you started looking at a longer service life, 40 to 60 years, you may see some marginal benefits. But I think at this point, we're kind of a little bit more in the weeds than we need to be.
So are you saying you're front loading the costs there, or
No, we're not.
or
No, they are
stretching them thinner to make it look better?
No, not at all. Not at all. They are the same. We're not front loading the costs at all. So what happens for a regulated utility is when they make a capital investment, those capital costs essentially are amortized over the life of the asset, right? So they are
Which is going to be more than 20 years, presumably, or 15,
which
right?
would be more correct. So, but the longer the service period, the longer the amount of rate of return you have, the lower the depreciation expenses. So just by having it over a longer period of time or a shorter period of time, it's not like a one-to-one impact. So I think the $20 to $30 million estimate is probably accurate over, that 40 to 50 year sort of time frame.
Mm-hmm.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Anastasia, for your question. Dawn, please go ahead with yours.
I'm just curious, what is a tie and what's involved in rebuilding it?
So I can talk about what the tie is, and I probably will avoid talking about how you exactly rebuild it, just because that's kind of outside my area of expertise. But essentially, the US is split over kind of the Eastern Interconnect and the Western Interconnect, with El Paso Electric being in the Western Interconnect and the SPP for the most part being in the Eastern Interconnect, although it is expanding westward. So in order to maintain system reliability, you need systems to be running on the same frequency. And when you have two kind of separate systems, they're not always running at exactly the same kind of specifications, frequency, and such. So when you go from the Western Interconnect to the Eastern Interconnect, what you typically do, Don, is you go from AC, so alternating current, into direct current, and then back up to alternating current in order to make sure that you're coming in at the same frequency on the eastern side of the tie. So that's kind of a piece of electrical equipment that is required for the East and the West to kind of talk to each other in layman's terms. In terms of rebuilding the tie, I can't go into details, it's outside my expertise, but I'm sure there's significant construction work in new electrical equipment.
This is Leslie today. I'll just add for folks' information. I mean, the original CCN for the Eddy tie, I believe, was issued in either it was 1978 or 1982. It is past the end of its useful life, and it's not working at full capacity as a result. But any more details I don't think it's worth getting into here, and I don't have the expertise either.
Well, I mean, I'm just trying to visualize a $200 or $300 million project. Is the construction itself or whatever needs to be done there much less, and the 200 million to 300 million includes interest over a period of time, or what are we? I just trying to imagine what this is that's costing that much.
So Don, before you ask we've got Renewable Energy Transmission Authority expert Eric on the line with his hand up. Eric, would you care to add? Looks like you care to add a comment. Please go ahead.
Yeah, and sorry, I don't have the specifics for Don, but my question really was the 345 line out of the DC tie in Eddy that goes to the west to AMRAD or something. How much capacity does El Paso Electric have on that line? And so uprating this to 200 megawatts, you're not going to run into any capacity problems on that line?
Margie, I'm going to just say right now we're kind of way outside the realms of what's been modeling.
Okay. I thought Eric might have an answer to the specific construction upgrade.
Yeah, I would just say from an economic modeling perspective, this certainly appears on face value to have legs and something that should be explored. But I think in terms of like the cost estimate, exactly what construction needs to be done, the kind of looking more at a transmission power flow type approach, I think all of those analyses are what come from this initial kind of screening. Yes, economically it makes sense.
these-
Anastasia, may I ask in that connection, what were this 70 megawatt, the 70 megawatt firm allocated capacity, is that based on the same questions that Eric's asking about, what the capacity is, or does it derive from the 200 megawatts times EPE's prorated interest? Because I know P&M has a stake in that facility also, right?
Yeah, so the 70 megawatts of accredited capacity is not what Eric's describing. So essentially we have 200 megawatts of import and export capability across the time. Now that's from an energy perspective. The question then becomes, what accredited capacity value do you assign from that diversity benefit of being connected to the SPP? Or also being able to import energy at times of need. Now, we did that somewhat conservatively. We used 70 megawatts as a somewhat conservative number based on historically how much energy EPE believes they could import from the East during times of critical periods. So that is how much accredited capacity or effective load carrying capability that you could have from having a greater connection to the East. Again, that is, like based on historical performance of the tie during critical need periods.
So that's actually a physical test, not a contractual one.
It is more of a probabilistic study. So it's more of a kind of like how much value can you assign to having import capability from a reliability perspective.
Physical reliability, I guess I'm saying, is it physical reliability, or is it the sharing between the co-owners?
Yeah, so it's not physical. So the physical assumptions that we have made is there is always the ability to import 200 megawatts, right? So if you always had 200 megawatts every hour of every year available on the eastern side of the tie, then the reliability contribution of that tie would be 200 megawatts. The effective load carrying capability, the accredited capacity would be 200 megawatts. But to be conservative, the way we've done this is said, okay, is that really a realistic assumption? If EPE are a position where they need generation, should they just assume that the neighbors, have enough generation to send their way? So again, making somewhat of a conservative assumption, we've said, okay, maybe about a third of that. So you could rely on about 70 megawatts of energy being available during those critical needs periods. So again, it's somewhat of a arbitrary number that is based on historical performance. It's not like we just made it up. We've kind of looked at what could EPE import over that tie during the hours of the greatest need. What's available on the other side.
And I guess this is probably more of a question for Emmanuel than for you, but I think that at the presentation to the commission back in the spring, there was something of information about in recent years, the actual receipt was like in the 40 megawatt range because of the actual degraded physical condition of the facility. And so I think the 70 number is higher than what EPE was talking about in the short term. Maybe Manuel can help me, or somebody else.
The 70 number is higher because that's what the marketing department had determined that they could find that was readily available in the market all the time.
Oh,
The 40 megawatt limit is, I believe, something that is going on right now because of current transmission constraints, but rebuilding the tie also includes the rebuilding of the transmission around it, which would increase that capacity. So it is a physical limitation right now, the 40 megawatts, but I believe in terms of emergency, that can be moved up. But we can reach out to Omar Gallegos from the transmission department because he would have more details on that. They're the ones leading that project. So I want to make sure I'm not giving you any incorrect information.
Yeah, I'm encouraged to hear you calling it a project. That's a good sign.
So
and
Anastasia, I'm going to end this conversation. We do need to move on. It sounds like there's reason to explore this as a possibility, but the technical details and even the construction details and operational details are yet to be determined. So I think I cut Dawn off earlier.
well, what does that mean then for the, for the IRP and the action plan? Is that the end of the line?
Obviously, we're that if there's a suggestion about what to do about this analysis, that comes in the action plan. Yep. Of which we've asked stakeholders for ideas on that. You got an email on Monday, asked you to start putting together ideas for action plans. So it certainly can be an idea that we can prepare for discussion on the 24th. Thank you. Dawn, did you have a follow-up question about cost? And then we're going to take Chris's question, and then we're going to move on because we've got lots to cover on the ELCC conversation.
No,
So
I'm
Dawn,
good. I'm fine.
are you good? Okay.
Yep.
All right. Thanks, Dawn. Chris, go ahead, please.
Sorry, I was just going to answer Don's question a little bit. The SunZia, there's a lot of DC interconnects that have recently been done. So having some ballpark ideas about what the converter stations cost is kind of out there and is a little bit current. And so that's where they can zero in on that. And it's a thyristor controlled valve hall. And all it's doing is taking AC, converting to DC, and then taking that DC and converting it back to AC. So you can do bidirectional flow between two non-synchronous grids. And Emmanuel's correct because I have had this conversation prior. They are SAG limited in some of the spans along that line. A typical 345 is an 800 megawatt, call it, facility. It could be 800 to 1,000 depending on type of conductor and stuff. But they do have some SAG limitations that they can improve the capacity of the line in addition to what's coming across the current DC intertie. Thanks.
Thanks so much for that. Very, very helpful. Appreciate it.
Okay.
All right, Ben, would you like to continue? I know we have lots to cover.
Okay, so I'm just going to really quickly do the long duration energy storage because this is just a very, very minor correction. So you will recall we presented the LDES scenario in the 7th stakeholder meeting. And there was kind of one slide I paused upon because I felt like there was an incorrect number. So let me just get down to show what that correction was just real quickly. On these two slides, 20 and 21, your note is corrected in this top corner. There was a very minor issue with these tables. What they were showing in the last stakeholder meeting was a higher value for 4-hour storage and a lower value for 100-hour long duration energy storage. The total of the two was exactly the same. So all of the modeling was correct. There's no issues at all with the modeling. Just as we presented the data, we were using incorrectly an average of these two, as opposed to assigning separate ELCC values for the 4-hour storage versus the long duration hour storage. So again, no impact to the modeling. It was just really just an allocation issue on these two slides. Really the crux of the matter here is if you were to look at the slides from the prior meeting, it would appear that long duration energy storage had around about a 50% ELCC value, which was what was causing me some heartburn. Now, if you look at it, it's much, much higher than that. It's 180 out of 200, so whatever that maths ends up being. So that was just a very, very minor correction that needed to be made. We also were asked by a stakeholder to provide our cost assumptions for the long duration energy storage. These were previously presented in the 5th stakeholder meeting. So this slide is not new, it's just coming from a prior version. And you can see on this slide the cost here of iron air batteries or 100-hour battery energy storage on this chart. I will say, and I mentioned this in the last meeting, that a developer did reach out to me, a developer of this technology, and they felt like this line here that currently rises with inflation, so nominally it's kind of rising year on year, they felt like it should actually decline even nominally, that kind of technology improvements were going to drive this cost down into the mid 2030s and 40s. So just want to stress that, you know, as I mentioned in the 7th meeting, the estimates for emerging technology, for technology that's not widely commercially available right now, have a higher margin of error than obviously the technologies that are more commercially available, where there's lots of cost data out there. So one interesting thing would be, you know, as we issue RFPs in the future, is to see if these costs potentially do come in lower, you know, maybe as we go out into the future. The other thing on the long duration energy storage, I just wanted to circle back to just very quickly, was the round trip efficiency. So if you recall, as we look at 4 and 8 hour batteries, we're typically looking at lithium ion chemistry. Lithium ion has a round trip efficiency of around about 85 to 88, 90%, meaning for every kind of 100 megawatts you put in on the front end, you get 85 to 90 megawatts come out on the back end. With the long duration energy storage, they're usually using a different kind of technology. They're using a metal air technology. So in our case, we're looking on iron air, and they just by technology currently right now have a much, much lower round trip efficiency. So we did model it at 45%. If improvements are made with that technology that can increase that round trip efficiency, that in turn will improve the cost effectiveness. But again, there's not really much we can do about that right now. We can't just go and assume LDES can have a 90% round trip efficiency until we start seeing technology go through pilot programs in the marketplace that maybe is a higher efficiency value. So those were just a couple of kind of corrections and clarifications I just wanted to make for long duration energy storage. All of the modeling results remain the same. Again, the only change being to the kind of some of the data presented on the slides. So I'll pause there. Margie, any questions before we move on to the meat of this meeting?
Chris, I see one question from Chris, and then we'll move on.
Yeah, you actually hit my round trip efficiency question for the long duration storage. I've been used to seeing 28 to 35% for iron air from DOE. That's improved over the last several years.
Yeah, so it works both ways, Chris, right? So, you know, if it's able to come in higher, fantastic. It works out a little bit more economic. If it comes in a little bit lower, then obviously less economic. I would say right now, the value of long duration energy storage is more capacity related. It's giving you a high ELCC. So I'm not saying there's not energy value, that absolutely is, but the RTE, if it's plus or minus 5%, probably isn't going to move the needle as much as what these costs end up coming in up.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. I was just that's the one thing that I hadn't heard before. So thank you so much.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Thanks, Chris. Ben, thanks for that update on that analysis. Please move to the ELCC conversation.
All right. So I am going to try and get through 20 years of resource planning experience in 30 minutes. So I'm going to go quickly. I will strongly encourage everyone to read these materials offline. They will be posted on the website. And if you have any questions, please let me know, and we can go back and forth via email. But let's talk about ELCCs real quickly and also planning reserve margin requirements. So throughout these presentations, we've presented the loads and resources table on several occasions. And there's really three components of a loads and resources table. You have your firm load obligation, so your load forecast. You have a planning reserve margin on top of your load forecast, and then also the accredited capacity of your portfolio of resources. And then from those figures, you can calculate whether you either have enough capacity or you require additional capacity. So for time, I cannot get into the load forecast in today's meeting, but what I did want to talk about was give you some more information on how the planning reserve margin was calculated, and then also how the ELCCs for the existing portfolio and the new resources were calculated. There's a lot of slides here. I'm going to go quick, but again, encourage you guys to read this offline. I think the crux of this slide here is just resource adequacy is becoming more important, more complex as we transition away from firm and dispatchable, mostly coal, gas, nuclear resources across the nation to more intermediate resources. So we're looking at kind of, wind, solar, and then energy duration, limited resources like battery energy storage. Highlighted just the one thing I want everyone to take away from here. The concept of planning exclusively for peak demand is very quickly becoming obsolete. And really what's driving resource adequacy events is often net peak demand. So this graph in the top right-hand corner here, is from the 2020 rolling blackouts in California that was caused by issues with the net peak and not necessarily the system gross peak. And then anyone who remembers 2021, going back to Winter Storm Uri, obviously the blackouts in Texas caused in the winter and not necessarily the summer peak where the system is at its highest gross demand.
Ben, sorry, can I interrupt you? Can you go back? Can you explain the difference between net peak and gross peak, please?
Sure, absolutely. So gross peak is just the demand on the electrical system. So every single hour, if you look across 8,760 hours of the year, there's demand on the electric system. So an instantaneous amount of load being provided to customers. And when we talk about gross peak demand, we're talking about the highest demand hour over the course of a year. Now, for a system like El Paso Electric, it's almost always in the heat of the summer, kind of hour ending 5 p.m. as everyone's running their air conditioning units. There are obviously systems across the nation that peak at different times. There's winter peaking systems in the north, for example, but for EPE, we're talking summer peak. When we talk about net peak, we're talking about that same gross peak minus renewable production during that given hour. And I'm really going to get into that in a moment. So you could just think, how do renewables reduce the gross peak? And then what other resources need to fill in the remainder between the renewable production and the peak demand? And I'm going to show several charts that address that.
Thank you.
So resource planning best practices, this is kind of where most of the industry is kind of moving towards. This is what El Paso Electric do. I will also note that some stakeholders brought up the Colorado ELCC study in the last meeting. E3 did the Colorado ELCC and planning reserve margin study for PSCO here in Colorado, using exactly the same approach as we're doing here for El Paso. So first things first, we've got to look at the load. We also got to look at renewable production. So that's kind of step number one here. Then we have to determine understanding the variability in load and the variability in seasonal kind of requirements. How much capacity does a utility need in order to maintain system reliability? And then you need to determine, of all of the resource types, how much reliability do they contribute towards that total capacity need? And that hopefully will make sense over the next few slides. So this is a generic slide, and I'll talk about EP specific in a moment. First of all, when you look at load, you're looking at 40 plus years worth of data. So you don't just look at one weather year, you look at multiple weather years, and you look at load variability between each of those years. And generically speaking, kind of here at a high level, typically you're seeing somewhere between 5 to 10% difference between kind of like a normal weather year and kind of like an extreme year. So you can think like in Texas, 2021 had, or 2020 had an extreme summer. Maybe you see loads 5 to 10% above the kind of the average. So as you're looking here at historical years, you're starting to look at things like high weather. You're looking at correlation between loads and renewable conditions. So if you think during those really, really hot summer days, you've probably got pretty high solar penetration during those same points in time. You probably don't have a lot of wind generation at those given points in time, right? Typically when it's the hottest, you typically have pretty calm weather. You're also looking at energy and capacity limitations over that same period. So you're looking at duration, limited resources as battery energy storage, and then you're looking at kind of the dispatch behavior of those resources during those times. For EPE, we used 40 years worth of data. So we used 1982 to 2022 as we looked at EPE's load forecast. Without going into details here, we then created a neural network where we use machine learning to kind of develop additional what we call synthetic weather years. So they're kind of hypothetical weather years in which we look at kind of what weather did versus what renewable production did. And we kind of try and train the model to be able to create hundreds of different weather years with different renewable production. Apologies, this does get very technical, so I'm happy to come back to answer questions. Once you've determined your kind of load variability, the next step is to determine how much total capacity you need to serve that load. So what we really look at here is what we call perfect capacity, which is a hypothetical resource that is available at all times. So essentially what you're doing is you're saying, how much capacity do I need to be able to reliably serve my load variability over a planning horizon? And the way you do that is you look at a reliability standard. So you say, okay, I'm not going to assume I have a 100% reliable system. You typically have what you call a loss of load expectation. And you say, okay, I'm going to assume that over the course of 10 years, the acceptable reliability metric is 1 day of loss of load event or 2 days loss of load event. That becomes your reliability standard. And then you see how much capacity you need to have on the system in order to meet that standard. So what that would say is, okay, on a normal weather year, let's just say I have 1,000 megawatts peak demand, just as an example. I'm going to need 1,100 megawatts of this perfect resource that's always available in order to meet that reliability standard, understanding that loads are variable and change as weather conditions change. So you do that to calculate the plan and reserve margin requirement. And to look at El Paso Electric's plan and reserve margin requirement, if we look here, right now, El Paso Electric planning to a 2 in 10 year standard or a 0.2 in 1 year standard, meaning their reliability metric is every 10 years losing load 2 days. So that's kind of their reliability metric. In order to achieve that, you need to have a 9% plan and reserve margin requirement. So for every 100 megawatts of load, you need 109 megawatts of perfect capacity in order to maintain that reliability standard. By 2030, EPE are making their resource adequacy standard more stringent, and they're increasing it to a 0.1 day standard, which means you would only lose load once every 1 day every 10 years. This necessitates an increase in the PRM to 11%. So the plan and reserve margin requirement in the loads and resources table is 9% through 2029, rising to 11% in 2030. So if you were to take this firm load obligation, multiply it by 9%, you would end up with this PRM requirement. The total of the two is how much capacity you need. So just to give you some historical context here, I remember when we were in Las Cruces, Orland from NMPRC staff had some questions on different types of plan and reserve margin metrics. Historically, utilities used to use what they called an ICAP metric, or an installed capacity metric. With ICAP, basically what you're doing in a plan and reserve margin is you're covering both the variability in peak load due to weather. You may also be incorporating some operating reserves that I won't get into, but you're also incorporating forced outages of thermal units into the plan and reserve margin. So in other words, you're accepting the fact that thermal units are not perfect. They have forced outages. But the way you're accounting for that is you're just saying, hey, the plan and reserve margin to meet load variability is, for example, 10%. We're going to do a study and see how much additional capacity we need to cover the fact that thermal resources are not always available. So that's the way utilities used to do it. Where we're at now is what we call the perfect capacity approach, or the accredited capacity approach. The difference between the two is how you account for thermal units. So here you will say that the plan and reserve margin requirement includes variations in peak load, mainly due to weather. It will also include those operating reserves. But the forced outage rates for thermal units are assigned to the thermal unit themselves and not just kind of implicit within the plan and reserve requirements. So if you look at these two charts, on the left, you'll see installed capacity. This is how much you need, your total capacity need under an installed capacity approach. And then to the right, you'll see a perfect capacity approach, an accredited capacity approach. You actually need fewer resources. Now, in reality, you don't actually need fewer resources. What you need is fewer accredited capacity, and the gas resources, as I'll show in a moment, are actually getting less capacity because their thermal forced outage rates are embedded within the unit accreditation, not within the PRM. So just to go real quickly here, as you start looking at the effective load carrying capability of all of the resources, so as you measure the accredited capacity of each resource, you kind of add them all together to create or calculate the total ELCC, or the total accredited capacity value of the portfolio. And that is how you determine whether you meet your capacity need. What's important to take away from this is it's based on a marginal basis. So as you add additional resources, some of them have interactive effects on one another. So as you continue to add solar generation to the system, for example, the accredited capacity value of solar declines. Now, the reason that declines is because your net peak, so your gross peak minus your renewables, or your demand, minus your renewable production, starts shifting to later and later in the evening. So I'll show that again in one more slide. So again, just real quickly here, just understanding that no resource is perfect. So earlier on, we talked about the plan and reserve margin being based on this hypothetical perfect resource that's always available. There is no such resource. There's solar only can generate when the sun's out, wind only when the wind's blowing. Thermal resources, gas resources have forced outages. So there's no such thing as a perfect resource. So the way we calculate this is an ELCC value. So the lower the value, the less contribution that resource is providing to meeting reliability requirements. So you see here, typically, wind has a low ELCC value, meaning because EPE system peaks in the summer 5 p.m. hour, then wind typically isn't blowing. It has a relatively low contribution to reliability. Dispatchable resources, on the other hand, such as natural gas, which are available when you need to start them, have a higher reliability value. You can essentially press a button, start them up. They can meet that peak demand, but they are not perfect. They will have forced outages. They will, on times, be unavailable. So that's why this receives less than 100%. So I promise it's going to get a little bit easier in a moment, but here's just kind of demonstrating some of the diminishing capacity values of two resource types. So we can look here at the value of solar and down here at the value of 4-hour lithium ion storage. So solar, this first tranche here in very, very dark orange, has the highest capacity value. And you see that here in this bar chart, which is just illustrative. So what you're saying here is, as I add that initial tranche of solar onto EPE system, it really aligns very well with their resource need, with their gross peak. So it starts having very high reliability contribution. But as you start adding more and more solar generation to the system, you start pushing the net peak to later in the evening. So at the moment, your gross peak stays at 5 p.m. But if we look here in the gray where you see your net peak, you start seeing this solar generation is pushing your net peak out into hours ending 7 p.m., 8 p.m., 9 p.m. So continuously adding more and more solar to the system provides diminishing capacity value. And you see that as you start seeing these tranches of ELCC increase, you start seeing them come down. The same can be said for 4-hour storage. If you look here at the gross peak, if you have a 4-hour battery available and you kind of shave off 4 hours from this initial peak, it has high reliability value. But as you start having more and more batteries on the system, your net peak becomes flatter and longer. So that has a couple of effects. One is you start seeing 4-hour storage have a decline in value because now the net peak is longer. And then the other kind of effect here is you start needing longer duration energy storage. And that's why you start seeing more value assigned to 6-hour storage, more value to 8-hour storage, until you get to a point where you actually need multi-day storage because the reliability events become extreme weather conditions. Finally, I'll go through this pretty quickly here. Certain resources have complementary effects on one another. So solar and storage, for example, work well together. As you add solar to the system, you push the net peak from 5 p.m. to 7 to 9, sort of that region. So just adding solar has a diminishing value. If you just add 4-hour storage to the system, it has diminishing value because those net peaks become longer in duration. Adding solar and storage together has a complementary value called a diversity benefit. So as you add solar to the system, you start pushing the net peak out to those early evening hours. And as the sun's going down, the solar stops generating, you can start discharging those batteries to take you through to, hour ending 12, 1 a.m., 2 a.m. So there's a diversity benefit of adding solar and storage. In other words, the sum of the parts is actually great. The total is greater than the sum of the parts. In the interest of speed here, there's other examples of synergistic pairings. Solar and wind go well together. Solar and storage go well together. Solar wind goes well with hydro. And then there's also antagonistic pairings, such as storage and hydro, storage and demand response. They're essentially doing the same thing, right? So if you have a lot of 4-hour batteries on the system and you add a lot of 4-hour demand response on the system, potentially they're both competing for the same kind of reliability benefit. So they have agnostic pairings to one another. If we look here, we have the ELCC of EPE's existing portfolio. So this is it on a nameplate basis. And I've broken it down into 4 categories: demand response, gas, nuclear, and then solar storage together because they have those complementary benefits I was just describing. And if you look here, you will see the accredited capacity value of those resources. This accredited capacity value is what goes into the loads and resources table. So this is what's counted towards meeting the load plus the planning reserve margin requirement. And you would see here the ELCC values of those resources. I think there may be a very slight issue with the demand response. I think this number is actually lower than I have. So fundamentally, I don't think it changes anything, but I think this one may be slightly incorrect. But gas has a 91% ELCC. So the existing gas on EPE system using the ELCC method has a 91% accredited capacity value. So for every 100 megawatts of natural gas generation on the system, on average, it's providing 91% of accredited capacity. And that's because, again, it's not 100% reliable. Nuclear, similar. Nuclear a little bit more reliable than natural gas. And then solar plus storage is relatively low at 35.7. But that reflects the fact that EPE already has a pretty significant amount of solar and storage on their system. Just breezing through these real quickly. This, I've already described this. This to the left here is the loss of load hours for EPE's existing system. So generally the hours where EP systems most at risk is between 5 p.m., 6 p.m. based on their current resource mix. By 2030, as they continue to add solar and storage to the system, you'll see the net peak becomes a little bit later in the evening. In the most hours at risk here are kind of 8 and 9 in the evening. That's because they've got an abundance of solar on the system. Here are the EPE specific values for solar. So you see right now, because they have such a high amount of solar on their system, they're getting relatively low ELCCs. So the next incremental 500 megawatts from where they are today will only have about 17% ELCC value. So for every 100 megawatts you add, you'll be getting about 17 megawatts of accredited capacity. And then their 4-hour lithium ion storage, currently at 46% ELCC. So for every 100 megawatts, you get 46 megawatts of accredited capacity. That will be dropping down to kind of 43% or 43 megawatts for the next 500 megawatt increment. I'm going to go through quickly to give some time for questions here. If we look here, this is that kind of complementary effect I was describing. So these are standalone values, just continuously adding solar but without storage, or continuously adding storage without solar. But if you look here, you can read this chart and say, well, if I were to add 1,000 megawatts of storage and add 1,000 megawatts of solar, what is the combined reliability contribution of the two? And again, it's greater than the sum of the parts. So if you would just add each individually. Wind, we did 3 different ELCC calculations for wind based on 3 different geographical locations. So we looked at wind kind of close to El Paso's service territory, north of Lordsburg here. We also looked at wind at Artesia and Albuquerque, which have kind of a higher capacity factor. Now, having a higher capacity factor, meaning the amount of energy it produces over a year, doesn't necessarily mean you have a higher ELCC value. What really matters is how much energy is being produced at times of system need. But generally speaking, if you have a higher output, you're more likely to have higher production during the hours that are needed, and in turn, you have a higher ELCC. So looking at the wind resources here, you can see it kind of starts off around 40%, which is extremely high for wind if you've worked on other utilities IRPs in the past. The reason is simply because EP does not have much wind on the system today. So that first kind of tranche is pretty valuable. But as you continue to add wind in, mostly generating in the fall, the spring months, and then also kind of late in the evening, has a diminishing value pretty quickly. So I will wrap it up on the next slide, just showing you here the slide for EPE based on the last stakeholder meeting. This will show you the capacity need. that is for New Mexico. That aligns with the loads and resources table. This will show you the effective load carrying capability for solar, storage, and wind based on those studies I just described and the decline in value. And you will see if you add up these ELCC values, it matches this total, meaning EPE are building enough accredited capacity to meet their plan and reserve margin requirements and no more. I think I will not go into demand response now unless I have any questions. So Margie, I'll stop there. Any questions on everything I just presented?
Thank you, Ben. As you know, our motivation was to give more explanation to people about how the ELCCs were valued and how they fit into the modeling analysis. Now, I do see one question from Cynthia Mitchell. I was going to go to Cynthia and Orland first because they had requested this topic as an office hour topic, and then we'll go to the other hands raised. But Cynthia, I believe your question is essentially disputing that the value of ELCC for gas resources appears higher than your experience would indicate. So Ben, would you like to go back to the slide that shows the natural gas ELCCs? And Cynthia, would you like to correct my interpretation of your question?
Yes, Margie, I would. I didn't say that it's higher than my experience would indicate. I don't have any experience with natural gas ELCCs. What I was citing was an excerpt from staff's P&M IRP report in which we reference the work of Interwest and their work and analysis that gas units actually have higher forced outage rates due to what's really a lot of extreme weather conditions. And I was just offering that as a comment. It's not really anything to get into a discussion with Ben at this time. And I would defer the short time that we have over to Orland for his question.
Great, but thank you, Cynthia, for raising that question about the gas ELCC. Thank you.
Margie,
Yeah.
sorry, just before Orland asks his question, I'm happy to stay on for a few more moments if you want, because I do want to address Cynthia's comments because I think that is very, very important.
Okay, all right. Well, maybe we should address them now.
Wait a second.
Address those
I
now.
would like to be able to digest this slide deck on ELCC and talk to 2 or 3 other people about it that have more expertise than I do on this area and not churn up time right now, maybe getting explanations that are not as useful to me as they could be with a larger group or a group that includes the peers that I rely on some for this. So Ben, if that's okay with you, I'm actually
absolutely
placeholder in this. I appreciate you doing all this work though. Thank you.
So let me just clarify where we are in the process. There's not another opportunity to have an ELCC conversation about, we're at the point where we're digesting model results to inform statement of need and action plan. Certainly Ben offered,
Margie, I understand that.
Ben did offer to follow up if people have questions about this after today through email. So that all right.
Thank you.
Okay. Orland, over to you for a question you might have about the ELCC analysis process.
No questions for me. I'm waiting for final filings. So I think these are, at the time, I believe these are still being worked on. So I think these are kind of illustrative at this juncture. So I'm just waiting for the report. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I see we have Chris and Anastasia and Glenn. Chris, please go ahead.
Ben, on slide 44, when you're looking at the comparative combined value, I know that in the DER scenarios, there seems to be obviously higher value when it's embedded in the load pocket versus central station. This is central station analysis for combining the value?
This is, yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Anastasia, I think your hand is up next.
Thank you. I hope my question is almost as short as the last one. So on slide 43, where the battery ELCC is shown in the sort of low 40%, is that a function of the technology of the battery or the shifting net peak curve?
It's a function of the duration of the battery and the penetration of the batteries. The duration being the fact that they're only 4 hours.
Right.
So, and the penetration being how many are on the system. So as you add more batteries to the system, you start kind of shaving off this peak area, which means you need longer duration batteries. So a 4-hour battery has a lot of value initially, where you're kind of shaving off that gross peak. But as you start kind of getting into a lower, flatter net peak, you need longer than 4 hours. And that's why you see this kind of very declining curve here.
And what assumptions do you make about when you discharge the battery? I mean, why not stagger it or something to achieve better results?
Oh, so so just to be clear, you absolutely could have 2 back-to-back 4-hour batteries, right? So essentially, let me go back to this one. You have a 4-hour battery here versus a 4-hour battery here, right? So you can kind of daisy chain them to make an 8-hour battery. The typically though, it just becomes more expensive to build 2 4-hour batteries than it would be to build 1 8-hour battry. So what you would just
I'm not necessarily referring to at one location or in conjunction with one solar facility. I'm just thinking if you had your solar and battery your solar and battery facility here, and you discharge, and then the other one you charge it up, but you discharge it start discharging at a different point in the evening. Is that something that's contemplated within the modeling, or are you setting more rigid criteria?
No, absolutely not. The batteries can discharge staggeredly. They are there to meet that reliability need. It's not like they all are set on a fixed time scale. And just to also clarify just one point, this is on a system basis here. This doesn't necessarily mean the solar and the storage has to be physically connected or coupled or at the same location. This is just system wide.
Okay, thank you.
Great, thank you. Glenn, I think we have time for your questions for today. Thank you, Glenn.
Yeah, I just want clarification on what I'll call the ELCC D rate, where that enters into the modeling and planning process, because when I look at this, say the solar only plot right here, this looks like what the output of your 8760 simulation would produce using the nameplate value as the solar as an input, and that output would be showing us what the ELCC is, right? So I'm just trying to clarify if the ELCC is an input to your 8760 hour capacity expansion model, why wouldn't that double count it?
Can I get you to rephrase that? Sorry, I kind of lost you on the double counting piece.
Well, okay. So you said we figure out an ELCC based upon the mix of solar and storage. And that ends up in the load and resources table. Is that load and resources table the output of the modeling process, or is it an input?
So the loads and resources table is predominantly both an input and an output, right? So the loads and resources table, as we look at capacity expansion modeling, is kind of what you need. So you plug in your input is your existing portfolio, right? And this is for capacity expansion, not for ELCC modeling. You enter in all of your existing and your planned resources, and that tells you whether you can meet your capacity need or not. And then you run the capacity expansion optimization, and that looks at the cost of resources and their ELCC values. and then creates a portfolio that meets that shortfall, right? And the portfolio is based on their economics and their reliability contribution.
Right. And isn't it an optimization over 8,760 hours?
It depends on how the settings of the model. So sometimes you do it as sample days to make it less of an optimization, but it's actually an optimization over the entire planning horizon. So it's over multiple years.
Okay, so it could be 20 times 8,760. So that's what you mean.
Correct. Correct.
Yeah, so I just don't get how if it's simulating every hour, the peak shifting effect is built into the simulation. So therefore you're seeing exactly how much it can produce given its nameplate in the simulation. So why would you also derate it with ELCC?
Well, so I'm trying to follow along with you here. So you're saying in the capacity expansion model, during a given hour, a solar facility may be producing 30 megawatts. For example, 100 megawatt solar
During the peak
site
of the sun day, it might produce 100% of nameplate, right? Like for the peak of the system, but the solar might peak out at 100% of nameplate earlier in the day, right?
Correct. So, but you would need, in order to take that approach, you would need two things. You would need one, for that solar production to be exactly the same on every single day for the 20 years, right? And we know solar production is variable, so you need to count into account the variability of the solar profile.
Right. I thought you said you were using a P50 production model for every hour.
Exactly. So P50 production is variable on an hourly basis,
Yeah.
but doesn't vary year by year, right? It's an average. It's a P50 production.
Yeah.
So you wouldn't also take into account the shifting effects, right? You would have a constantly change in value because as you added in more solar generation, as your net peak shifts, your production of that solar resource would shift. So I'm guessing.
Yeah, I guess I feel like that would just fall out of your modeling, and so therefore you wouldn't need to add this extra ELCC because your model is good enough to model, you know, on a P50 basis how good the solar and everything else. Well, yeah, solar and wind is, right? So that's what I'm missing. It's like it seems like you're double derating. The model is accurate. It models what's actually happening on an average basis. And then you're derating on top of that. That doesn't make sense to me.
So,
okay,
Glenn, Ben, let me interrupt. I think, Glenn, I know you joined us late today, so I'm going to encourage you to listen to the first part of Ben's presentation to understand the full methodology. And if there's still questions you have, maybe Ben offered to follow up on email with people if there's questions. So can I encourage you to do that? And and we can make sure your understanding is full at that point. Great, thank you. Great, thank you for your questions. As we mentioned, we will be posting this slide deck on the GridWorks website. We'll let all stakeholders know that it is there. Ben has offered to follow up if there's specific questions. Again, we are at the point where modeling variations are not open for change by stakeholders. We're through the modeling process, and now we'll move to the statement of need and action plan. So if you have questions that relate to the inputs or methodology, certainly we can get those answered. The focus now, though, is on interpreting these results as they do inform the statement of need and action plan. If you have ideas on these topics or other topics that we've talked through the workshop series about action plans you'd like considered by EPE, please put those in the worksheet that we sent out to you on Monday. Kathy has put a link to that in the chat as well so that you can get access to that. Feel free to put as many suggestions as you have into that. We will be collecting it, organizing it, combining it with input from the utility to start our conversation on July 24th about action plan and statement of need as well. So I'd like to thank Ben and EPE for their materials. Especially like to thank all the stakeholders who put topics into the request for conversation at the last workshop. And again, I'd like to invite you to a week from today from 3 to 4:30. The main feature, the leading band for that show is going to be a synopsis of the modeling results to help us all pull that together and understand the implications of that for statement of need. So stay tuned for that. We will be letting people know that that is the primary topic for the 16th. And with that, let me turn it over to Judy in case you had any closing remarks.
Thanks, Margie. I just wanted to thank you and the GridWorks team for organizing these continued office hours and allowing us the opportunity to answer stakeholder questions. Definitely a huge shout out to Ben and the E3 team for really helping us to organize this and answer the questions and just put the information out there and really explain all these topics, and our modeling team as well, who have put in a lot of long hours and really helped to get this together, but most especially the stakeholders too. We're really happy to hear like your feedback, and we want to be responsive to all your questions, and thank you for attending these office hours. I know they're outside the workshops that we've been having, but again, we want to make sure that we're answering your questions and getting you the information that you're looking for throughout this process.
Great, thank you. And I see that Glenn, Ben, would you like to let people know how they should reach you if they have follow-up questions?
Sure. Let me just, I should just type my email address here in the chat would probably be the easiest.
Fabulous. There you go, Glenn.
Thank you.
Sure. Great. Thank you. Ben, anything you'd like to add?
No, I think I'm good. I'm happy to kind of respond to Glenn here. And if it's advantageous, Margie, as I'm having these conversations, I can let you know. And if they're valuable to the entire group, we can send them out.
That'd be great. Good. Okay, thank you so much and have a great afternoon. Bye-bye.
Thank you all.